Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty fundamental, and I think with your philosophical mind, you're going to find this one super interesting. We're talking about death,
Oh, yeah.
you
Well, the
know,
big one,
the big one, death. Now, at first glance, it might seem pretty straightforward, like a simple biological event,
right?
but the more you kind of peel back the layers, the more fascinating and complex it gets.
Yeah, and the deeper you go into this question, the more you realize how it's tied up in all these other huge philosophical questions like, what is a person? What does it mean to be alive?
Exactly.
How do we know anything at all?
Yeah.
It just spirals out from this seemingly simple question.
And to guide our exploration of this pretty vast and deep topic, we're going to be going deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the definition of death.
I'm excited to get into this one.
Yeah, and it's dense. It's a lot to cover, but we're going to be unpacking all the really key arguments and insights. Kind of think of us as your, companions through this dense philosophical landscape.
I like that, yeah. Guides through the jungle of ideas.
That's us.
So what's the mission here?
Mm.
What are we hoping to accomplish in this deep dive? I think there are a few key things. First, we want to dissect the different viewpoints on what exactly constitutes human death.
Right.
Like, what are the criteria we should use to determine if someone is dead or not?
Because it's not always as clear as it might seem at first glance.
Right, exactly. And second, we want to lay bare the underlying assumptions that fuel these different views. Because these assumptions often have to do with some of the biggest philosophical debates about the nature of reality, the self, consciousness,
Yeah, like all that good stuff.
all the good stuff. And the goal here is to provide some clarity, to really illuminate the core concepts and arguments, even in those areas where there just isn't any clear consensus, which, as you might imagine, there are plenty of those.
Right, plenty of areas where philosophers are still kind of, going back and forth.
Battling it out, yeah.
So to kick things off, let's just consider a few really basic questions.
Okay, I like it.
Is death like a single definable event? Like a clear switch from alive to dead? Or is it more accurate to think of it as a process, a gradual transition?
Yeah, that's a great question. And on top of that, how should we even go about defining death? Is it a purely biological phenomenon, or is it something more? Is it tied to our notion of personhood?
Yeah. Or, is it something else entirely? Something we haven't even considered.
Right. Maybe it's something totally beyond our current understanding.
So yeah, let's plunge into this.
Let's do it.
All right, so the first thing we really need to understand is why this whole definition of death thing became such a pressing issue in the 20th century.
Okay, yeah. For most of human history, this wasn't really a huge debate. I mean, the answer seemed pretty obvious. Heart stops beating, breathing ceases, you're dead.
It was just kind of a given, right?
Right. And this wasn't just because of a lack of medical knowledge. It's because severe brain damage would almost always lead to respiratory failure, which would then cause the heart to stop.
Oh, so the systems were already linked in that way.
Yeah, they were all tied together.
It was like a deadly domino effect.
Exactly.
But then the 20th century rolls around and things get a little more complicated.
Yeah, things get a lot more complicated. Medical technology starts advancing rapidly, and suddenly we have the ability to intervene in ways that were never possible before.
And I imagine this is where respirators come into the picture, right?
Exactly. The invention and use of mechanical respirators in the 1950s was a game changer. Suddenly, you could have individuals who had suffered what would previously have been fatal brain damage. Their breathing and circulation could be artificially maintained.
So basically you could have a body that's being kept alive by machines, but the brain itself is gone.
Right. And this raises the question,
Yeah.
is this individual still alive?
Yeah. And that question, as you might imagine, wasn't just a medical one. It had huge philosophical and ethical implications.
Oh, yeah, it cut right to the core of what we believe about life, death, personhood.
And then things get even more complex with technologies like defibrillators in the 1960s.
Right. Now we can restore cardiac function even after the heart has stopped. So this traditional sign of death, the stopping of the heart, it's no longer a guarantee of anything.
Yeah, you could have someone's heart stop and restart, and they could be perfectly fine.
Exactly. So it became clear that these traditional vital signs, breathing and circulation, they might not be the best indicators of whether someone is truly alive or dead.
So this wasn't just an abstract thought experiment for philosophers.
Or no.
This had real, practical, urgent consequences.
Extremely urgent. Think about it. soaring medical costs, the ethics of keeping someone on life support indefinitely, the desperate need for organs for transplantation. These were all pressing
It
issues.
was a perfect storm of medical advancement and ethical dilemmas.
Exactly. And all of this brings us to that landmark 1968 Harvard Medical School Committee report, the Beecher Committee.
Ah, yes, the Beecher Committee. They really kind of set the stage for a lot of the debates that followed.
Totally. They were grappling with all these issues, trying to come up with some clear guidelines for defining death in this new world of medical technology. And their report played a huge role in shifting the focus towards neurological criteria.
So basically, they were saying maybe the brain and not the heart or the lungs is the key to understanding death.
Exactly. And this is really where we see the emergence of brain-based definitions of death.
All right, so let's talk about the first and probably the most dominant of these brain-based approaches, the whole brain
All
approach.
right, the whole brain approach. So what does this actually say about death?
Well, it says that death is the irreversible cessation of functioning of the entire brain, including the brainstem.
The whole shebang. The entire brain has to have stopped working permanently.
Right. And it's not just that the brain has stopped working, it has to be irreversible.
Irreversible is key here, like no chance of recovery.
Right.
And this is tied to a particular way of thinking about death, the organismic definition of death.
Organismic definition, so it's about the whole organism, not just one part.
Exactly. This view says that death happens when the organism as a whole stops functioning as an integrated unit.
It's like the whole system breaks down.
Yeah, like a machine that's just fallen apart. The individual parts might still be there, but the machine itself is gone.
And so the brain, in this view, is seen as the ultimate integrator of the body, right?
Right. The brain is like the central command center.
Right.
It's what keeps all the different systems working together in a coordinated way.
Like the conductor of an orchestra, keeping everything in sync.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And when the brain shuts down permanently, that's when the whole organism ceases to function as a unified whole.
So the whole brain folks would say that even if a machine is breathing for you, even if your heart is still beating artificially, if your entire brain is gone, you're dead.
Right. It's like the puppet master has left the show.
Yeah.
The puppets might still be there, but they're not moving anymore.
Yeah, no one's animating them.
Exactly.
Now, is this whole brain view like a radical new idea?
Well, not entirely. Some proponents argue that it's actually just a sophisticated update to the traditional cardiopulmonary standard.
Ah, okay, so they're saying it's not a complete break from tradition.
Right. They argue that breathing and heartbeat, the traditional signs of life, were always just indicators of this deeper, underlying integrated functioning, which is ultimately controlled by the brain.
So in the past, when your heart stopped, it meant your brain had also stopped. But now we have technology that can kind of disrupt that natural connection.
Right. So the whole brain criteria are seen as a way to look past these superficial signs and get to the real heart of the matter, which is the brain.
It's like we have a new window into the functioning of the organism.
Exactly.
Now, this whole brain approach has really had a huge impact on the legal landscape, hasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, think about the Uniform Determination of Death Act, the UDDA, which has been adopted in most states.
Right, the UDDA. That's the big one when it comes to legally defining death.
Yeah, and it basically lays out two ways to determine death. Either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem.
So it acknowledges both the traditional cardiopulmonary standard and this newer whole brain standard.
Right. And it's interesting to note that some other countries like the UK, they use a slightly different neurological standard, the brainstem standard.
So that one just focuses on the brainstem, not the entire brain.
Exactly. They see the brainstem as the really essential part for basic life-sustaining functions.
So all of this is to say that this whole brain approach has some pretty clear advantages, right?
Yeah.
It allows for organ transplantation, which is a huge ethical and practical benefit.
Right.
And it helps to make decisions about discontinuing life support, which can be very costly and sometimes, may feel pointless if there's no chance of recovery.
Yeah, it helps us avoid those really difficult situations where we're just prolonging the inevitable.
So it's a very practical approach in a lot of ways. But even with all these advantages, the whole brain standard has its critics.
Of course, yeah. This wouldn't be a deep dive into philosophy if there weren't some good arguments against it.
Right, exactly.
So, what are some of the issues that philosophers have raised?
Well, one of the main challenges is whether whole brain failure is truly necessary for death in all cases.
Okay, necessary.
Right. So, are there any cases where someone could be considered dead even though their entire brain hasn't stopped working irreversibly?
Hmm. Interesting.
And this is where we get into the tricky territory of embryos and fetuses.
Right, because very early on in development, they don't have a fully formed brain.
Right. So, if whole brain death is the definition of death, how do we account for the death of a fetus that never had a fully functioning brain?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I mean, does the definition just not apply in those cases?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that the definition only applies to individuals who have developed a functioning brain.
But that feels kind of arbitrary, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like saying that death means something different for different stages of development.
And it leaves open the possibility that someone with a fully developed brain could die without their entire brain shutting down.
Right, which kind of undermines the whole idea of the whole brain standard.
Exactly.
And this leads us to those fascinating and sometimes disturbing thought experiments involving brain transplants.
Okay, so let's imagine a future where we can seamlessly transplant brains.
Okay, so I get a new brain.
Right. But let's say your original brain is still alive and functioning.
It's just chilling in a jar somewhere.
Right.
Still thinking, still experiencing.
But your original body, the one without the brain, is it alive or dead?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't have a brain, and it would be completely dependent on machines.
Right, so it seems pretty dead.
Yeah. But if you believe that you are essentially the organism, the whole package, then wouldn't that mean that you, the original you, would have died, even though your brain is still functioning somewhere else?
Hmm, that's a tricky one.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. Because it suggests that total brain failure might not be necessary for the death of the human being.
Right. It's a really interesting challenge to the whole brain view.
For sure.
And on top of that, there's the question of whether whole brain failure is truly sufficient for death.
Okay, sufficient. So now we're asking, are there any cases where someone's entire brain has permanently shut down, but they might still be considered alive in some sense?
Right. Because if whole brain death is truly sufficient for death, then there shouldn't be any cases like that.
Okay, so what are these potential counterexamples?
Well, there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that even in individuals who meet the clinical criteria for whole brain death, certain bodily functions can persist.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, like what kind of functions?
I'm talking about things like homeostasis, temperature regulation, wound healing, even the assimilation of nutrients and detoxification.
Wow, that's pretty wild. I mean, I thought the brain was supposed to be in charge of all that stuff.
Well, it turns out that maybe it's not as simple as we thought.
So the brain isn't the only one calling the shots.
Maybe not. And there have even been cases where brain-dead pregnant women have gestated fetuses to term.
Really?
Yeah. And even cases of brain-dead individuals going through puberty or continuing to grow.
That's incredible. It really challenges the idea that the brain is the sole integrator of all bodily functions.
Exactly.
Like there's some other kind of organizing principle at work.
Maybe.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. And to make matters even more complex, studies have shown that some patients diagnosed as brain dead still exhibit residual brain activity.
Wait, so even though they're brain dead, there's still some activity in the brain?
Yeah, things like EEG activity, living neurons, even hypothalamic function, which
Yeah.
plays a huge role in regulating hormones.
That's pretty confusing.
It is, because if these individuals still have some degree of brain activity, can we really say that their entire brain has irreversibly ceased to function?
Yeah. I mean, where do you draw the line?
Exactly.
Is it just a matter of how much activity there is?
Right. And then you have cases like locked-in syndrome where individuals are fully conscious but have extremely limited bodily function.
Oh, yeah, locked-in syndrome. That's a really tough one.
Yeah, because if total brain failure is sufficient for death because it means the loss of all brain-integrated bodily function, then the loss of those functions alone should also be sufficient for death, right?
Yeah, I mean, logically, that seems to follow.
But we wouldn't say that someone with locked-in syndrome is dead, would we?
No, of course not.
So there's clearly a disconnect there.
It seems like the whole brain definition needs some tweaking, or maybe we need to rethink the whole idea that the loss of brain-integrated bodily function is the key to defining death.
Okay, so those are some pretty serious challenges to the whole brain standard, but people have tried to defend it, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And one of the ways they've tried to do this is by proposing something called the fundamental work rationale.
The fundamental work rationale. Okay, so what's that all about?
Well, the idea is that a human being dies when they irreversibly lose the capacity to perform the fundamental work that's characteristic of a living organism.
So basically, they're saying that there are certain things that living things do, and when you can't do those things anymore, you're dead.
Right.
Okay, so what are these fundamental things that living things do?
Usually it's broken down into three main capacities. First, receptivity to the environment.
So basically, being able to sense and respond to the world around you,
Exactly. And second, the ability to act on the world to get what you need.
like seeking out food or shelter.
Exactly. And finally, having felt needs that motivate you to do those things.
So you need to actually feel like you need those things.
Right. It's not just a mindless automatic process.
Okay, so the argument is that someone who's brain dead, even if they're on a ventilator, can't do any of these things.
Right.
But someone who's alive, even if they're severely disabled, still has at least some of those capacities.
Yeah, that's the basic idea.
But of course, there are some problems with this fundamental work idea.
Oh, yeah, there are definitely some issues.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, think about robots.
Robots.
Yeah. Some robots can sense the environment and act on it, right?
I mean, I guess so.
But we wouldn't say that robots are alive.
Right.
So the first two criteria, receptivity and action, they don't seem to be enough.
So maybe you need all three, including felt needs.
Right. But then you run into another problem. What about things like plants or simple animals?
Do they have felt needs in the same way that humans do?
It's not so clear.
And then there's the issue of unconscious humans, like someone in a coma.
Right. Do they cease to have needs just because they're unconscious?
So this fundamental work idea, it seems like it might be a bit too simplistic.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't quite capture the complexity of life and death.
Okay, so beyond those big philosophical issues, there's also the question of whether the whole brain standard is clinically adequate.
Okay, clinically adequate.
Yeah, so the question is, does the way we actually diagnose whole brain death in the real world always line up perfectly with the philosophical definition?
So it's a question of whether our practice matches our theory.
Exactly.
I can see where this is going.
And it turns out that there can be some discrepancies.
Discrepancies.
Yeah. So some patients who meet the standard tests for whole brain death, they still show some signs of brain function.
Really?
Yeah. Like maybe some minimal EEG activity.
So some electrical activity in the brain.
Yeah. Or they might have some isolated living neurons.
So there are still some brain cells alive.
Right. And in some cases, even continued hypothalamic function.
And the hypothalamus, that's like a really important part of the brain. It regulates all sorts of things like hormones and body temperature.
Exactly. So if all brain functions haven't truly stopped, can we really say these individuals are brain dead according to the strict definition?
Yeah, it kind of blurs the lines a bit.
It does.
So how have people tried to deal with this issue?
Well, some have argued that we need even more rigorous testing to make sure there's really no brain function at all.
Like, we need to be absolutely certain.
Right. But others have acknowledged that there might be some residual function, but that it's just too minimal to matter.
So it's like saying that for all practical purposes, they're brain dead.
Right.
And there's another approach, right? You mentioned Baguette's critical functions approach.
Yeah. So Bernat, he basically tried to revise the whole brain standard to make it more realistic.
More grounded in the actual clinical reality.
Right. So he said that death should be defined as the permanent cessation of the critical functions of the organism as a whole.
The critical function, so it's not about every single function, just the ones that really matter.
Exactly. And he identified 3 critical functions: spontaneous breathing and circulation control, homeostasis, and the capacity for consciousness.
Okay, so breathing, circulation, keeping the body stable, and being conscious. Those are the big ones.
Right. And if all 3 of those are permanently gone, then that's death.
Makes sense. It's a more nuanced approach than just saying all brain function has to cease.
Yeah, it's a bit more flexible.
So does this revised approach solve all the problems?
Well, it's definitely an attempt to address some of the challenges to the whole brain standard, but whether it fully succeeds is still up for debate.
Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation.
Okay, so that's the whole brain approach in a nutshell. It's got its strengths, it's got its weaknesses, it's got its controversies.
And lots of philosophical fodder for us to chew on.
Exactly.
But it's not the only game in town.
Right. There are other ways to think about death.
And probably the most prominent alternative to the whole brain approach is the higher brain approach.
The higher brain approach, all right, let's get into that. What's the central idea there?
So the higher brain approach defines death as the irreversible cessation of the capacity for consciousness.
The capacity for consciousness. So it's not just about being unconscious at a particular moment.
Right.
It's about the potential for consciousness being gone.
Exactly.
Like if your brain is so damaged that you'll never be conscious again.
Permanently out of the game.
Right.
No chance of waking up, no dreams, nothing.
And this has some pretty big implications, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Especially when we think about patients in a persistent vegetative state or an irreversible coma.
Right, those are the tough cases.
Yeah. Because under the higher brain view, even if they're breathing on their own, even if their heart is beating, they'd be considered dead.
Because that capacity for consciousness is gone,
Exactly.
which is a pretty significant departure from the whole brain standard.
It is.
So what are the arguments that people use to support this higher brain approach?
Well, one of the most common arguments appeals to the essence of human persons.
Essence. That's a good philosophical term. So what do they mean by essence in this context?
It's about the fundamental properties that make something what it is.
Okay, so the properties that are essential for something to exist is that kind of thing?
Right. And for human beings, the argument is that our essence lies in our capacity for consciousness.
So consciousness is what makes us human, what makes us persons.
That's the claim, yeah. And when that capacity is irreversibly lost, well, then the person has ceased to exist.
So even if the body is still alive in a biological sense, the person is gone.
Right.
But that raises another question. What exactly do we mean by person?
Ah, yes, the definition of person. That's a whole other can of philosophical worms.
Right, because some philosophers have a very strict definition of what it means to be a person.
Yeah, like they might say that being a person requires not just consciousness, but also things like self-awareness, reason, moral agency.
A whole package.
Right. And if that's your definition, then someone with advanced dementia who might still have some basic consciousness, they might not qualify as a person.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is. It's like saying that a human being can lose their personhood while still being biologically alive.
It really makes you think about what it means to be human.
It does.
And I imagine there are people who would argue against that idea pretty strongly.
Oh, absolutely.
But there are also those who have a broader view of personhood.
Like they might say that any human being with the capacity for consciousness, even basic consciousness, counts as a person.
Right. So that would include infants, people with certain cognitive disabilities.
Exactly. And this view aligns very well with the higher brain standard, right?
Yeah, because if you believe that any human with the capacity for consciousness is a person, then the loss of that capacity would mean the loss of the person.
Which means death.
Right, death of the person, even if the body is still functioning.
Okay, so that's one argument for the higher brain approach, the appeal to the essence of human persons.
Oh, okay, essence.
But are there any problems with this line of reasoning?
Oh yeah, plenty of philosophers have issues with it.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, think about fetuses.
Fetuses.
Yeah. If personhood is all about consciousness, then when exactly does a fetus become a person?
Because they don't develop the capacity for consciousness until pretty late in pregnancy.
Right, so what are they before that?
Are they just not persons?
Yeah, and what does that mean for their moral status?
It raises all sorts of ethical questions.
And what about people in a persistent vegetative state or anencephalic infants who are born without parts of their brain?
Are they not persons either?
It's a very tricky area.
It is.
And some proponents of the higher brain view, they might say that these cases, these beings, they might be biologically alive, but they're not truly alive in a personal sense.
So they're making a distinction between biological life and personal life.
Right.
And that leads to this idea of two separate beings, the biological organism and the minded being.
The two beings idea.
Yeah. So you have the body on the one hand, and then you have the conscious mind or person on the other.
And they're not the same thing.
Right. The body might come into existence at conception, but the minded being might emerge later when consciousness develops.
And the minded being could die before the body.
Which is kind of a weird thought, right?
It's definitely a strange idea. And it raises a whole bunch of philosophical problems.
Like, how exactly are these two beings related?
Yeah, what's the connection between them? Are
Yeah.
we just our brains?
Or are we something else?
Is the person just a part of the organism?
It's not an easy question to answer.
Not at all.
Mm.
And it also goes against this very intuitive idea that we are fundamentally human animals.
That we are our bodies.
Yeah. So this two beings idea, it's a way to try to make sense of the higher brain view, but it leads to a whole bunch of other puzzles.
Okay, so that was the first argumentative strategy for the higher brain approach. What about the second one?
All right, so the second strategy focuses on personal identity over time.
Personal identity, so it's about what makes you you over the course of your life.
Right.
And how does that relate to death?
Well, the argument is that regardless of what we fundamentally are, whether we're organisms or minds or something else, once our capacity for conscious experience is gone, the individual we were, with all their memories and experiences, has ceased to exist.
It's like the thread of consciousness has been broken,
Right.
and there's no picking it back up.
Exactly.
But as you mentioned earlier, any discussion of personal identity is going to be tied up with deeper metaphysical questions about what we are.
Right. You can't really talk about who you are over time without first figuring out what you are in the first place.
And if we're essentially human animals, then losing consciousness, even permanently, might not mean we've ceased to exist.
Right. The organism might still be there.
So this argument from personal identity, it often implicitly assumes that we're essentially minded beings.
Which, as we discussed, has its own set of problems.
Exactly. All right, what about the third argumentative strategy for the higher brain approach?
This one's interesting.
Okay, lay it on me.
It claims that defining death is ultimately a moral issue.
So it's not about biology, it's about ethics.
Right. So when we ask, when is someone dead, what we're really asking is, when is it okay to do certain things?
Like what kind of things?
Things like stopping medical treatment, donating organs, or having a funeral.
Ah, the death behaviors.
Exactly. And their argument is that these are fundamentally moral questions, so the answer should be based on ethics, not just biology.
Okay, I'm following. So how does this relate to the higher brain standard?
Well, proponents of this view say that the loss of the capacity for consciousness is the crucial ethical boundary.
It's the point at which it becomes morally permissible to engage in those death behaviors.
Right.
But of course, there are people who disagree with this.
Of course there are.
Like they might say that while death has moral implications, the definition of death itself isn't a moral concept.
Yeah, it's a separate issue.
It's about biology or metaphysics, and then we apply our moral principles to that.
Right. And even if we agree that the definition of death has a moral dimension, it's not clear why the higher brain standard is the most morally justifiable.
Yeah, why focus on consciousness specifically?
Exactly.
So if this third argument is going to be convincing, proponents of the higher brain view need to do some more work to justify why the loss of consciousness is the key moral consideration.
They need to make their case.
Right.
And that brings us to the fourth and final major argument for the higher brain approach.
Okay, hit me with